Let me ask you something right off the bat. Are you ready to build your firm's digital foundation? Because stepping up from just being an everyday user to actually becoming the technical leader, the person who sets the standards for everyone else, is a massive, massive leap. It's a journey from just doing the drafting work to actually designing how that work gets done. And in this explainer, we're taking that leap together.
Today, we're laying out the Revit blueprint for mastering BIM management. Now, whether you are officially stepping into the BIM manager role, or maybe you're just the brave soul who got tasked with getting the firm's templates in order, our mission today is really simple. We're going to take the utter chaos of a dozen users doing things their own, completely different ways, and we're going to transform that into a beautifully streamlined, highly efficient digital workflow.
Okay, let's dive into this. We're going to follow a really clear micro to macro blueprint today to build out your template. First, the BIM Manager role. Second, mastering lines and objects. Third, setting the project environment. Fourth, standardizing text and dimensions. And finally, packaging sheets and views.
Starting with Section 1, the BIM Manager role and choosing your starting point. Look, as the new leader of your firm's digital environment, you really can't just start from a completely blank slate. Your absolute first task is to pick a base template that makes sense for your specific discipline. So if you're in architecture, you start with the architectural template. If you're an engineer, you're going to grab the structural or mechanical template. You always want to build out from what you know best.
Moving on to Section 2, mastering lines and objects, which is really the foundation of your visual identity. You know, the very first step in establishing a firm's unique look isn't actually a logo. It's determining the crispness and the appearance of how your team actually draws. When a client looks at your plans, even just at a glance, the thing that distinguishes your firm from the competition is your line weights.
The line weight system runs from 1 to 16, and that is what completely dictates your model's appearance. But what's absolutely vital to understand here as a BIM manager is that these numbers, they aren't static wets. They scale dynamically based on the view scale. For instance, if you're at a large scale like 1.5 inches, the difference between these line weights is pretty subtle. But as you decrease the view scale, those differences become incredibly apparent. Grasping this relationship is totally critical to making sure your models always read clearly, no matter how they end up getting printed.
And hey, beyond just the thickness, you also have to define the patterns themselves. When you break it down, a line pattern is really just a rhythmic sequence of dots, dashes, and spaces. So for example, you can set a dash at 1/16 of an inch, followed by a space at 1/16 of an inch. Walking through the exact mechanics of setting these up manually is incredibly helpful, especially if you're transitioning a team that's super used to classic AutoCAD phantom lines. We all know how painful that transition can be, right? Well, you can perfectly recreate those familiar drafting styles by just tweaking these specific values.
Now we have to talk about a massive distinction between two heavily used menus that constantly confuse new users. On one hand, we have object styles. This is basically your holy grail as a BIM manager. These are the global defaults for the entire company. On the other hand, we have visibility graphic overrides. Those are just for making local spot changes in one specific view. As the person setting up a template, your focus needs to be laser-targeted on perfecting those object styles. You want to get the defaults right so your team doesn't have to rely on overrides all day long.
And when you dig into those object styles, there are specific categories you have to customize. You've got model objects, annotation objects, analytical model objects, imported objects, plus you need to define both cut and projection lines for every single one of them. Customizing the subcategories across all these elements is exactly how you lock in your firm's standard. Sure, it might take a little trial and error at first, but putting in that sweat equity right now prevents your drafting team from having to do that exact same trial and error on every single deadline.
While we're still down in the weeds looking at how users interact with the model at this micro level, we've got to touch on user snaps. You can set snaps for endpoints, midpoints, nearest, angles, and length dimensions. Now, obviously, individual users can customize or toggle these on and off depending on what they're doing right that second. But establishing standard snap increments as a baseline ensures your entire team is modeling with the exact same level of precise increments.
Let's move to Section 3 and see how this builds. Setting the project environment. We are looking at location, units, and data. We are zooming way out from those micro details of lines and snaps to the overarching data that defines the macro level of the project itself.
So, setting up your project information might seem like just basic, boring administrative data entry, right? Filling in the client name, issue date, project status. But let me highlight exactly why this matters. Take the project address, for example. You aren't just typing that in so it looks pretty on a title block.
Inputting an accurate project address directly influences critical weather modeling and energy analyses later on. The software literally uses that location to give you a near-perfect environmental model of your building site. Right alongside that project data, you have got to configure your project units. Whether you're using Imperial for a US project or metric elsewhere, you need to define the specifics for length, area, volume, angle, slope, the whole shebang. But here's a massive pro tip for you. Notice that currency is on this list. Adjusting that regional currency setting right up front acts as a huge time saver when you start running cost estimations later. It's a tiny touch, but it pays massive dividends.
Now, if you're sitting there thinking, man, this sounds like a ton of work to build from scratch, I have fantastic news. Let me introduce you to the ultimate time-saving cheat code, Transfer Project Standards. If your firm has an older project where you just perfectly nailed the line styles, text types, and materials, you can simply open that past project alongside your new template and transfer those standards directly over. You do not always have to reinvent the wheel. You just have to know how to grab the perfectly tuned elements you already built.
All right, Section 4, Standardizing Text and Dimensions. Locking in annotations. Look, standardizing text might seem like an incredibly small, maybe even tedious detail, but I promise you, it cascades into almost every single other tool your team is going to use on a daily basis.
Just think about the global impact of these textiles. It's a total domino effect. Your dimensions, your keynotes, your general annotations, they all rely entirely on the foundational text files you create right now. By taking the time to duplicate the default text files and configure them exactly to your firm's typography standards up front, you are saving the firm massive amounts of repetitive effort down the road. You set it once and the entire model inherits that consistency.
And you know, that exact same logic applies to your dimension styles too. Just like with text, you can grab an existing dimension style, duplicate it, and completely lock it in. You can adjust the line widths of the tick marks, tweak the text size, dial in the text offsets. You can even create those classic diagonal drafting appearances so that every single person in the office is producing drawings that look like they were drafted by the exact same hand.
Finally, Section 5, Packaging Sheets and Views, the finishing touches. This is the fun part. This is where all the foundational data we just painstakingly set up gets beautifully wrapped in the exterior packaging of your project blueprint. It's where the most tedious work gets fully automated.
Let's talk about standardizing your output. Out of the box, the software is going to use cardinal directions for elevations, or just super basic names for floor plans. As a BIM manager, you need to rename these to match your firm's specific conventions, like calling it Level 1. You want to enforce view scales before a user even opens a sheet. Utilizing sheet manager tools and templates to auto-generate standard views eliminates literally hours of mind-numbing repetitive labor. You want all that tedious setup completely done before the design team even logs in. And of course, the absolute ultimate wrapper for your views is the title block. You need to take total ownership of this by editing the title block family directly. Get in there, rip out the default Autodesk logo, modify the standard lines, and update the text and labels to perfectly match your company's branding. I know it sounds simple, it's just lines and text, but controlling these parameters ensures every single sheet that leaves your office absolutely screams professionalism and consistency.
So, the crucial point is perfectly captured in this quote. A big part of being the BIM manager is controlling the standards, helping your teammates, and really being the leader. Because that's what this is about. All of these technical setups we talked about, the line weights, the snaps, the title blocks, they aren't just software settings. They are acts of leadership. You are removing the friction so your teammates can focus entirely on design and client success.
Which brings us to the end of our explainer. Your template is built, the standards are locked, the digital workflow is totally mainstreamed, the foundation is there, and the tools are right in your hands. So how will you lead your firm into the next era of design? Thanks so much for joining me, and I absolutely cannot wait to see what you build next.